The gavel struck the wooden bench so hard that the sound cracked through the sweltering courtroom like a gunshot, and every soul in Redemption Creek held their breath. "Order!" Judge Harlan Beaumont bellowed, his face the color of sunburned brick beneath his graying whiskers. "I said order in this court." But Edwin Crawford was already on his feet, his hat clenched in both fists so tightly that the brim bent beneath his fingers, and his dark eyes were locked on the judge with a ferocity that made the two deputies near the door reach instinctively for their sidearms. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone that made up the canyon walls outside town. Dust still clung to his shirt from the ride he had made that morning, 15 miles at a dead gallop, the moment word reached him at the Crawford Ranch about what was happening here. "She did nothing wrong," Edwin said, and his voice was low and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting. "Not a single thing. And I will prove it myself, Your Honor, if you will give me the chance to do so before you condemn an innocent woman." Josephine Slater sat at the defendant's table with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight as a fence post, but the skin around her eyes was pale, and her jaw was clenched so hard Edwin could see the muscle working in her cheek from across the room. She would not look at him. She had not looked at him since they brought her in wearing borrowed shackles that were 2 sizes too large for her slender wrists. That was the detail that had undone Edwin the moment he walked through the courthouse door. Those ridiculous, oversized shackles on the wrists of a woman who had spent the last 8 months nursing sick cattle, mending fences in the rain, and quietly becoming the most important person in his world without either of them fully admitting it. Sheriff Dale Prescott, a lean man with small, close-set eyes and the permanent expression of someone smelling something unpleasant, stepped forward from his position near the wall. "Your Honor, Mr. Crawford has no standing in these proceedings. This is a criminal matter between the territory and the accused." "She is accused of murdering Gerald Voss," Edwin said sharply, turning to face the packed gallery of townsfolk who had crammed themselves into the courtroom the way they always did whenever something dark and dramatic fell upon their small community. "And Gerald Voss is not dead." The room erupted. Judge Beaumont's gavel struck 3 more times before the noise fell to a low, buzzing murmur, and every face in that gallery was turned toward Edwin Crawford with expressions ranging from outright disbelief to barely concealed hunger for drama. In Redemption Creek, Colorado Territory, in the spring of 1878, entertainment was a scarce commodity, and a murder trial was the finest kind they had. But what Edwin knew, what he had ridden 15 miles at dawn to say, was that the entire foundation of this trial was built on a lie. And the man who had built it was sitting right there in the front row of the gallery, dressed in his fine wool suit with his watch chain gleaming, watching Josephine Slater with cold satisfaction written across every feature of his well-fed face. Silas Voss, Gerald's older brother and the most powerful landowner in the county, smiled at Edwin Crawford with the serene confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He was wrong. But proving that was going to require Edwin to tear open the last 8 months of his life and lay them bare in front of everyone in this town, including his own complicated feelings for a woman he was not entirely sure would ever return them. He pressed his hat against his chest and met the judge's eyes. "Give me 3 days, Your Honor. 3 days, and I will show this court exactly what happened, who is responsible, and why Josephine Slater should walk out of here a free woman." 8 months earlier, Edwin Crawford had not wanted a bookkeeper. The suggestion had come from his foreman, a thick-armed, sun-weathered man named Pablo Reyes, who had worked the Crawford Ranch for 11 years and had, in that time, developed the habit of saying exactly what he thought regardless of whether Edwin wanted to hear it. The ranch was called the Red Mesa, and it covered 4,000 acres of Colorado high country, running cattle through summer pastures and wintering them down in the lower valley. It was a profitable operation, though not a tidy one, and the books that recorded its transactions were, according to Pablo, a catastrophe waiting to collapse. "You have not balanced the ledgers since your father passed," Pablo said one evening over supper in the ranch house kitchen, a plain, high-ceilinged room that still smelled faintly of the dried herbs Edwin's mother had hung there before she too was gone. "And the bank in town has written twice about discrepancies." "I know what the bank wrote," Edwin said. "Then you know you need someone who understands numbers." "I understand numbers fine." "You understand cattle numbers. You understand how many head we push through Raton Pass and what price they fetch. You do not understand interest calculations and quarterly reports and the kind of accounting that keeps a man out of trouble with the territory tax collectors." Edwin had stared at his coffee for a long time before he answered. He was 28 years old, and he had inherited the Red Mesa at 23 when his father died of a fever that swept through the county the winter after the great blizzard. He had been running it alone since, which meant he understood hard work and long days and the specific loneliness of a large house with no one in it but himself and occasionally Pablo and the handful of ranch hands who ate their meals in the bunkhouse. What he did not understand, or at least what he preferred not to examine too closely, was the bookkeeping problem, because the bookkeeping problem reminded him that his father had kept meticulous records and his mother had reviewed them every Sunday evening, and now neither of them was here to do either thing. "Fine," he said at last. "Put out word in town." The word reached Josephine Slater through Mrs. Alma Decker, who ran the dry goods store and served as the unofficial hub of all information moving through Redemption Creek. Josephine had been in town for 4 months by then, having arrived the previous fall from Kansas City with a carpetbag, a small trunk, and a set of credentials that she produced from a leather folio when asked. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a dry goods concern in Kansas City for 3 years, had completed 2 years of business schooling before that, and could provide 3 references if required. What she could not provide, at least not immediately, was a complete explanation of why she had left Kansas City and why she had chosen to stop in a small Colorado Territory town rather than continuing somewhere larger and more accommodating of a woman who worked for a living. Mrs. Decker did not ask, because Mrs. Decker was a practical woman who recognized usefulness when it presented itself, and Josephine had, in those 4 months, quietly become indispensable to half the businesses in Redemption Creek, who needed someone capable with a ledger but could not afford a full-time male accountant. She had also, more quietly still, become the subject of considerable speculation regarding her past, her present, and her intentions, because she was 25 years old and striking in an understated way that seemed to unsettle people who expected a working woman to be either plain or flashy, and Josephine Slater was neither. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up tightly and brown eyes that looked amber in strong light, and she had a way of listening to people that made them feel they had been heard in full before she responded, which was a quality so rare in the territory that several people mistook it for cunning. Edwin Crawford met her for the first time on a Wednesday morning in March when he rode into town to speak with her about the bookkeeping position, and the meeting went badly almost immediately, though not in any way that was her fault. He had walked into Mrs. Decker's store expecting someone older. He was not sure why he had formed that expectation, except perhaps that bookkeeper conjured in his mind someone gray-haired and bespectacled. What he found instead was a woman his own age sitting at a small desk in the back of the store with a ledger open before her and a pen in her hand, and when she looked up at him, her expression was politely attentive and entirely without the fluster that most women in this part of the territory performed when a rancher of Edwin Crawford's size and reputation walked through a door. "Mr. Crawford," she said, setting down her pen. "Mrs. Decker said you would be coming. I am Josephine Slater." "I know who you are," he said, which was not the smoothest beginning, but it was honest. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, and he sat, and they discussed the position for 40 minutes in terms that were entirely professional and revealed very little about either of them as human beings. She quoted him a fair wage, described the system she would use to organize the ranch accounts, and asked 3 precise questions about his quarterly cycle and the timing of his cattle sales that told him immediately she knew what she was doing. He told her the position was hers and rode back to the Red Mesa feeling vaguely unsettled in a way he attributed to the coffee he'd had at the hotel and refused to examine further. She came to the ranch the following Monday in a rented wagon driven by young Tommy Birch, who was 14 and hired out by his mother for odd jobs, and she set up her workspace in the small office off the main parlor that had been Edwin's father's study. The room smelled of old pipe tobacco and leather, and the desk in it was large and solid and the right height for working, and Josephine moved through it with the quiet efficiency of someone who was very good at making themselves at home in a space without claiming it. The first week was uncomfortable in the way that first weeks always are when strangers are suddenly sharing a working environment. Edwin spent most of his time outside, which was where he preferred to be, and Josephine spent most of hers inside with the Ledgers, emerging at noon to eat a brief lunch that she prepared herself in the kitchen with the calm matter-of-factness of someone who did not expect to be waited on. Edwin ate with his hands at ranch hands, at the long table in the kitchen, and the first time Josephine joined them at Pablo's insistence, there was a silence around the table that Pablo broke cheerfully by asking her opinion on the new calves, and she gave it, which surprised everyone present, because she had apparently been watching the operation with considerable attention during her first week. "The black and white heifer in the east pasture is favoring her left front leg," she said, reaching for the bread. "I noticed it from the office window yesterday afternoon." Pablo looked at Edwin. Edwin looked at Pablo. "I will check her in the morning," Edwin said. The heifer had, in fact, developed a slight infection in her front hoof that would have worsened considerably if left another week. Edwin doctored it the next morning and said nothing to Josephine about it, but after that, he started paying more attention to the kinds of things she noticed, which turned out to be quite a few things. By the end of the first month, she had organized the Crawford accounts into a state that the bank in town later described, in a letter, as remarkably coherent, and she had identified 3 areas where the ranch was losing money through inefficiency rather than misfortune, 2 of which Edwin had suspected, and 1 of which genuinely surprised him. She presented her findings to him on a Friday evening in the office, spreading the relevant pages across the desk in a way that walked him through the logic clearly and without condescension, and he listened with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between the pages and her face, and when she finished he said, "You are very good at this." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said, and it was not arrogance, just the same plain honesty that everything else she said carried with it, and for some reason it made him want to smile. He did not smile, but he thought about it later. Spring came to the Red Mesa in slow increments, the snow retreating up toward the high country, while the lower pastures greened and the creek that ran through the south quarter of the property began to run clear and fast with snowmelt. Edwin found himself inventing small reasons to come back to the house more often than he strictly needed to, which Pablo noticed without commenting on it for nearly 3 weeks before his patience ran out one evening over supper. "You checked the water troughs in the north pasture 3 times today," Pablo said. "I was checking the fencing. The fencing in the north pasture is fine. I checked it myself 2 weeks ago." Edwin ate a bite of his dinner and said nothing. "She is a good woman," Pablo said simply, and went back to his food. Edwin said, "Do not start." Pablo raised both hands briefly in surrender and did not start, but the damage was done because it forced Edwin to acknowledge, at least to himself, that he had been thinking about Josephine Slater with a frequency and specificity that went considerably beyond professional regard. He thought about the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when she was working through a difficult calculation, as if the answer might be found at an angle. He thought about the quiet sound of her moving through the house in the mornings, which he had not realized he had started listening for until the one morning she arrived an hour late because her wagon had thrown a wheel, and he had spent that hour standing at the kitchen window with a coffee cup he kept forgetting to drink from. He thought about the things she did not say, which fascinated him more than the things she did. She was open about her work and her opinions on practical matters, but she never spoke of Kansas City except in the most surface terms, and she deflected questions about her family with a graceful smoothness that he recognized, because he used the same technique himself when people asked about his parents, and he understood that the smoothness did not mean the wound was healed, only that the person carrying it had learned to walk without limping in public. He did not ask. He respected her privacy the way he respected good fencing. It served a purpose, and tearing it down without a good reason was the act of someone who did not understand how things worked. What eventually cracked that privacy open was not Edwin at all. It was Silas Voss. Silas Voss was 43 years old and had been the largest landowner in the county for a decade, ever since he had consolidated 3 smaller ranches through a combination of purchase, foreclosure, and, according to whisper, methods that nobody could prove but everybody suspected. His operation, the Voss Cattle Company, ran 10,000 head and employed 40 men, and he had standing arrangements with the railroad that gave him freight rates nobody else in the county could match. He was not a stupid man, and he was not, in the conventional sense, a dishonest one, because he had learned long ago that the most durable dishonesty operated entirely within the legal boundaries that he had spent money ensuring were drawn to his advantage. He had also, for several years, been carrying on a quiet and systematic campaign to acquire the Red Mesa. Edwin's father had refused to sell. Edwin had refused 3 separate offers since inheriting the property. The most recent refusal, delivered in January of 1878, had been terse and unambiguous. The Red Mesa was not for sale, would not be for sale, and he would appreciate Silas Voss directing his attention elsewhere. Silas Voss had smiled at this and driven his carriage home and begun formulating his 4th approach, which was considerably more creative than the previous 3. Josephine Slater had come to Redemption Creek, running from a man named Gerald Voss, who was Silas's younger brother and who had, in Kansas City, developed the conviction that Josephine owed him something she had not agreed to owe. Gerald was 37, handsome in the slack-jawed way of men who had been told they were handsome too often, and he had met Josephine when she was bookkeeping for his business associate and had decided immediately that she should become his wife. When she declined, he had decided that the matter required more persuasion, and his persuasion had taken forms that left Josephine no choice but to leave Kansas City with everything she could carry in a carpetbag and a trunk. She had not known, when she stopped in Redemption Creek, that Gerald Voss had a brother here. She had not known until the morning in mid-April when she was walking back from the mercantile with a parcel of goods, and found Gerald Voss himself standing in the middle of the main street looking at her, with an expression that mixed satisfaction and menace in proportions that made her stomach drop to somewhere around her knees. He had found her. Of course he had found her. Gerald was not a man who accepted the word no as a final answer, and he had the resources and the contacts to locate a woman who had simply gotten on a train and traveled west. She did not run. She was done running. She looked at him for 3 seconds and then turned and walked very steadily in the opposite direction, and spent the rest of that afternoon in Mrs. Decker's back room, breathing through what she would not call fear and working out what to do next. What she did not do was tell Edwin Crawford. She knew she should have. But there was a particular kind of pride that comes from being a woman who has managed her own affairs through considerable difficulty and managed them well, and asking for help felt, to Josephine, like admitting that everything she had built in Redemption Creek could still be dismantled by the presence of a man who had no right to dismantle it. Gerald Voss spent a week in town. He visited the saloon. He spoke with Silas. He sent Josephine 2 notes, both of which she burned without answering, and he appeared twice on the road near the ranch, though he never came through the gate. Edwin noticed the second appearance because he happened to be riding the fence line that afternoon and saw the figure of a horseman sitting on the road watching the property. And he did not recognize the man at the distance, but he noted it with the quiet alertness of someone who knew what it meant when strangers watched his land. He mentioned it to Pablo, who asked around in town and reported back the following morning that the stranger was a man named Gerald Voss, brother to Silas, visiting from Kansas City. Edwin went still at this information in a way that Pablo recognized as the stillness before the thunderstorm. "Does Miss Slater know he is here?" Edwin asked. Pablo looked at him with eyes that said he suspected she knew very well. "I think perhaps you should ask her that yourself." Edwin found her in the office that afternoon, and the conversation that followed was the first one they had that was genuinely difficult. He set his hat on the corner of the desk and asked, simply, whether she knew Gerald Voss, and she looked at him for a long moment with those amber-brown eyes and made her decision about how much to tell, and told him everything. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, which made it worse, not better, because the plainness of it left no room for misunderstanding what Gerald Voss was and what he had done and what he apparently intended to continue doing. When she finished, the silence in the office had the quality of the air before a lightning strike, dense and charged. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" Edwin asked, and the question was not accusatory, just direct. "Because it is my problem," Josephine said. "And I am capable of handling my own problems." "I am not disputing your capability," he said. "I am saying that you are on my land and under my employment, and if someone is making trouble for you in connection with either of those facts, I should know about it." She looked at him for a long time. "And if I told you and you decided the trouble was more than the position was worth," he met her gaze, "then you would have misjudged me considerably." Something shifted in her expression at that, something small and carefully controlled, but he saw it. "He will not stop coming," she said. "He never stops." "I know how to deal with men who will not stop," Edwin said, and he picked up his hat and went to speak with Pablo. What he did over the following 3 days was methodical and contained no violence. He rode into town and spoke with Sheriff Prescott, which turned out to be largely useless because Gerald Voss had not technically committed any crime in the county, and Prescott was not a man inclined to action that might annoy Silas Voss, who was a significant source of the informal funding that kept certain community resources, including Prescott's own position, operational. Edwin then visited the lawyer in town, a quiet man named Mr. August Hartley, who wore a perpetual expression of mild concern and was, underneath that expression, quite sharp. Hartley confirmed what Edwin suspected. Without a formal complaint and a documented pattern of threatening behavior, there was little legal recourse available. "What is available to you," Hartley said carefully, "is the force of your own reputation and position, Mr. Crawford. You are not without standing in this county." Edwin understood what Hartley was not saying directly, and he went back to the ranch and thought about it for 2 evenings before he reached a conclusion that surprised him somewhat by how clear it felt once he got there. He found Josephine on the 3rd evening after supper, sitting on the porch steps watching the last of the daylight drain out of the western sky, which in that part of Colorado went through colors that seemed operatic and excessive even after you had seen them hundreds of times. He sat beside her, not close, but close enough that the warmth of the evening air between them was a perceptible thing. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I want you to hear it as a practical matter before you hear it as anything else." She turned to look at him. The last light was doing something complicated with the color of her hair. He kept his eyes forward. "Gerald Voss will continue to pose a threat to you as long as you are a single woman with no formal connection to this ranch beyond employment," he said. "If you were my wife, his position would be considerably more complicated. Silas would not allow his brother to harass the wife of a neighboring rancher he has maintained at least cordial relations with, because the social cost would outweigh the personal satisfaction. And Gerald himself strikes me as the kind of man who is bold against the unprotected but cautious around anyone who might actually fight back. The silence stretched out long enough to become its own kind of conversation. "You are proposing to me," Josephine said, and her voice was entirely even. "I am making a practical case," he said. "Edwin." She said his name, the first time she had used it without the "Mr." attached, and the sound of it stopped something in his chest. "Are you capable of making an impractical case, or is this genuinely the best you can do?" He looked at her then, and she was watching him with an expression that held something warm beneath the steadiness, something that had been building for weeks in the quiet spaces between professional transactions and morning coffee and evenings on opposite sides of a ranch house. And he felt the full weight of how thoroughly he had been fooling himself about the nature of what he was actually feeling. "I think," he said slowly, "that you are the most remarkable person who has come into my life since I stopped believing that remarkable people came along more than once, and I would like you to stay. Not because of Gerald Voss, because of you. The practical case is real, but it is not the reason." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You should have led with that." "I know," he said. "I apologize for being an idiot." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. "I accept the apology, and the proposal, Edwin, both of them." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in the Redemption Creek Church, with Pablo Reyes and Mrs. Decker as witnesses, and August Hartley as the man who drew up the paperwork that would, Edwin believed, provide the practical shield that would end Gerald Voss's campaign of harassment. He was correct about the effect it had on Silas, who sent a cool but civil note of congratulation and thereafter stopped, at least visibly, pushing for the sale of the Red Mesa. He was incorrect about it ending anything, because what Edwin had not fully understood was that Silas Voss's interest in acquiring the Red Mesa had not diminished. It had simply found a new strategy, and that new strategy required something far more ruthless than a purchase offer. The summer of 1878 passed on the ranch in a state that was, for Edwin Crawford, the closest thing to happiness he could remember experiencing in 5 years of solitary operation. The marriage had begun in the practical, somewhat awkward manner of two people who had agreed to something significant before fully understanding each other. But the understanding came quickly, and it was better than either of them had anticipated. They were, as it happened, extraordinarily compatible. Not in the smooth, frictionless way of people who have carefully softened themselves to fit together, but in the productive, generative way of two people who are both direct and curious and capable of disagreement without damage. Josephine had opinions about the ranch operation that went beyond the bookkeeping, and she expressed them, and about half the time she was right in ways that Edwin could not deny, and the other half the time the discussion itself sharpened his own thinking. He had forgotten what it was like to live with a person whose mind was genuinely engaged, and rediscovering it was something he found himself grateful for every day in a way that felt almost embarrassing in its intensity. The impractical things happened more slowly, because they were both people who had learned to be careful with impractical things, but they happened. An evening on the porch in June, when the conversation ran long past dark, and they discovered they were reading from the same very small library of books. A morning in July when she rode out with him to check the north pasture fence, and they spent an hour fixing a section of it side by side, working in a comfortable silence that occasionally broke into speech and slipped back into silence without awkwardness. The first time he touched her hand, which was accidental, reaching for the same ledger in the office, and they both went still for a moment before he looked at her and said, quietly, "I am not going to pretend that was an accident," and she looked back at him and said, "Good," and the ledger was not opened for another hour. By August, The Red Mesa felt like a place where two people live together, which sounds simple but is, for anyone who has lived in a house that contained only themselves, a transformation of the most fundamental kind. Edwin came home from the range at the end of the day with something to come home to, and Josephine moved through the work of the ranch accounts with the settled focus of someone who is where they are supposed to be. Pablo Reyes, who had worked for Edwin Crawford for 11 years and understood the man better than anyone, watched all of this with the contained satisfaction of someone who had been right about something important. The darkness, when it came in September. Gerald Voss arrived back in town at the end of August, which Josephine heard from Mrs. Decker and reported to Edwin with a composure that cost her more than it showed. He had brought nothing with him except, reportedly, a great deal of bad temper and renewed purpose, and within 2 days of his arrival he had spoken with his brother at length and then visited the sheriff's office for a conversation that Prescott declined to summarize for anyone who asked. On the 7th of September, 1878, Josephine drove the wagon into town alone. She did this regularly, for supplies and to conduct business with 2 of her former bookkeeping clients who had retained her for occasional work even after she married Edwin. And Edwin did not accompany her, because it was a Wednesday and Wednesday was when the hands drove the cattle down from the upper pasture, and he needed to be there. They had discussed it and agreed it was sensible for her to manage the town errands independently. She was returning from the mercantile when Gerald Voss stepped out from the narrow passage between the hardware store and the feed merchant and stopped in front of her horse. The horse shied and she steadied it with practiced firmness and looked at Gerald with eyes that did not waver. "Get out of my way, Mr. Voss," she said. "I want to talk to you, Josephine. There is nothing you have to say that I wish to hear. Move aside." He moved not aside but forward, putting his hand on the horse's bridle, and said a number of things that she would later be very careful and deliberate in describing to Edwin. And the core of those things was that her marriage to Edwin Crawford meant nothing to him, that she was his in a way that some men of that era believed came from the sheer force of their own desire, and that she would be making a serious mistake if she believed a wedding ring changed anything. She told him to take his hand off her horse's bridle. He did not. She had, in the wagon under the seat, a small caliber pistol that Edwin had insisted she carry, and that she had practiced with enough to be competent. She did not reach for it, because she did not need to, because at the moment when the confrontation was escalating beyond speech, 3 men came around the corner from the main street, one of whom was old Mr. Parsons, who ran the feed merchant, and Gerald Voss stepped back and released the bridle and straightened his jacket and smiled at Josephine with the specific smile of someone who is establishing, for witnesses, that this was all perfectly cordial. She drove back to the ranch and told Edwin exactly what had happened. He listened in a silence that was qualitatively different from his usual silences, and when she finished he said, "I am going to speak with Prescott in the morning." "Prescott will do nothing," she said. "He never does anything that affects the Voss interests." "I know," Edwin said, "but I am going to speak with him regardless so that it is on record that the complaint was made, and then I am going to speak with Hartley about what other options exist." "Edwin," she touched his arm and his whole attention came to her face. "I am not afraid of him. I want you to know that. I am angry. There is a difference." "I know there is," he said. "I am angry too. But I am also determined, which is different again." The visit to Hartley the following morning produced a practical suggestion. A formal written complaint filed with the county court, documented and dated, which would not itself stop Gerald but would create a paper record that could be used in future legal action if his behavior continued and escalated. Hartley prepared the document and Edwin signed it as Josephine's husband and primary witness, and it was filed with the court clerk by noon. What they did not know, because no one thought to tell them until it was too late, was that the court clerk was a man named Hicks who was deeply in debt to Silas Voss and had been for 2 years. The trap was set with the elegance of something that had been planned for months, possibly since Gerald first returned to town. Edwin would reflect on this later with the particular sick feeling that comes from realizing that a danger you had assessed and prepared for was actually the method of your defeat, that the very precautions you took were woven into the plan against you. 3 days after the complaint was filed, Gerald Voss was found unconscious in the alley behind the saloon with a wound on the back of his head, and a note in his pocket in handwriting that was, according to Sheriff Prescott, identifiably that of Josephine Slater. The note said, "You were warned." This is only the beginning. Josephine had written no such note, but the handwriting was close enough to hers, combined with the documented complaint, to give Prescott the excuse he had apparently been waiting for. Gerald Voss was alive but badly hurt and could not, or would not, speak clearly about what had happened, and in that vacuum of ambiguous evidence Prescott arrested Josephine Crawford on suspicion of attempted murder. She was at the ranch when they came, the morning of the 13th of September, 2 deputies and Prescott himself arriving in a wagon that announced, by its formality, that this was not going to be a brief conversation. Edwin was in the barn when they arrived. By the time he came running at the sound of voices raised at the house, Prescott had already read the charge to Josephine, and she was standing in the doorway of the ranch house with the expression of someone who has just received confirmation of something they had been afraid was coming. "This is absurd," Edwin said flatly. "She has not left this property in 3 days. "We have a witness who says different," Prescott said. "Name the witness." "The witness will be named in court, Mr. Crawford." "That is how this works." "Take those shackles off her," Edwin said, looking at the oversized iron manacles one of the deputies was holding, and there was something in his voice that made the deputy look at Prescott, and Prescott, after a moment, shook his head, and they put them on anyway. Edwin rode to town behind the wagon and went directly to August Hartley's office and spent 45 minutes there before the day was out. And by that evening, he had a plan that was more complicated and required more courage than anything he had undertaken since inheriting 4,000 acres at the age of 23. He also had a determination that went beyond anything practical or strategic, because it was grounded in the simple and absolute conviction that Josephine Slater had done nothing wrong, and that allowing the machinery of a rigged system to grind her under it was not something he was willing to contemplate. He rode back to the Red Mesa in the dark and sat at the kitchen table and thought through everything he knew, and what he knew when he arranged it carefully was this. Gerald Voss was not dead, which meant the charge was attempted murder, not murder, which was serious but offered more room for defense. The note was forged, and forgery could be demonstrated if he could get the right people to examine it alongside legitimate samples of Josephine's handwriting. The witness Prescott had mentioned was almost certainly someone in the employ or debt of Silas Voss, which meant they could be pressured or their credibility could be attacked. And Gerald Voss himself, if he actually spoke, might say something inconsistent with the story being constructed around him. The trial was set for 5 days hence, before Judge Harlan Beaumont, who was a man Edwin did not know well but who had, in the territory, a reputation for taking his position seriously even when it was inconvenient. That was something. He went to bed at midnight and was back up at 4 in the morning, and he rode 60 miles in the next 2 days. The first day he rode to the county seat and found a handwriting examiner named Professor Elias Cord who worked out of the college there and who had testified as an expert witness in 3 prior cases. Cord was a slight, methodical man of 50 who took the samples Edwin brought him, 6 letters Josephine had written in the normal course of her bookkeeping work, and compared them with the copy of the note that Hartley had obtained from the court clerk, and produced, within 4 hours, a written analysis that identified 8 specific features of the suspected note that differed from Josephine's established hand in ways consistent with deliberate imitation rather than genuine authorship. The second day, Edwin rode to a farm 12 miles east of town, where a ranch hand named Pete Hollings had recently left Voss employment under circumstances that Pete described, when Edwin found him, as being asked to do something I was not willing to do. Pete was a rangy, sun-darkened man of 32 with honest eyes and a grudge that he had been nursing in private, and when Edwin laid out what he needed, Pete was quiet for a long time and then said, "Gerald Voss told 2 men that he was going to take the Crawford woman down a peg before the month was out. I heard him say it. I will say it in court." Edwin pressed Pete's hand and rode back to Redemption Creek, feeling that the shape of the truth was coming clear. He also, on that second day, made a stop he had not planned. He had ridden past the Voss ranch house on the far side of the county road, and on impulse turned in at the gate, because there was one more piece of information he needed, and he suspected that Silas Voss, who was proud and who underestimated Edwin in the particular way that powerful men underestimate those they have tried to buy and failed, might provide it if Edwin played the conversation correctly. Silas received him in the front parlor of the Voss ranch house, which was larger and more ostentatiously furnished than Edwin's own, but had the specific coldness of a room that is decorated for impression rather than for living. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and sat across from Edwin with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed events were proceeding in his favor. "I am sorry about the business with your wife," Silas said, in a tone that said clearly he was not. "Gerald has always been hot-headed. But the evidence is what it is." "The evidence is interesting," Edwin agreed, "particularly the handwriting. I had it examined." Something shifted in Silas's eyes, brief and controlled. "Is that so?" "By a professor from the county college who has testified in 3 cases. He finds the note is not consistent with my wife's hand." Edwin looked at Silas steadily. "You knew Gerald was coming back. You knew what he was planning. I think you helped him plan it." Silas's expression settled into a careful blankness. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Crawford." "It is," Edwin agreed. "I will not be making it in court. I will not need to. What I am going to prove in court is that the note is a forgery, that the witness your brother or your money has produced is lying, and that Josephine had every reason to file a legal complaint against Gerald, and no reason to attack him physically when the courts were moving in her direction." He set down his whiskey glass. "When I have done all of that, I am going to ask Gerald in front of the judge to describe in detail what he was doing in that alley and how he came to have the note in his pocket. And I suspect that conversation will be very illuminating." He stood and picked up his hat. "You want my ranch, Silas. I understand that. It is good land and it borders yours, and it would make your operation substantially more efficient. But there is no version of this plan that results in you getting it. There is only a version where you get the worst kind of trouble in a territory that is becoming, by the year, less tolerant of the methods you prefer. I am giving you the opportunity to consider that." He walked out and rode back to town, and he was not entirely sure whether the conversation had been wise, but it had been honest, and honest things, in his experience, tended to produce more useful reactions than calculated ones. The morning of the trial arrived with the brassy September heat that made the courthouse in Redemption Creek feel like the inside of a Dutch oven, and the room was packed from the first bench to the back wall, with townspeople who had opinions about every aspect of what was happening, and were not shy about expressing them in the whispered, charged tone of a crowd that smells blood or justice, and cannot yet tell which. Josephine was brought in from the small holding room behind the courthouse, and when Edwin saw her in those oversized shackles, his jaw tightened in the way that Pablo Reyes would have recognized as the outer edge of a feeling. Edwin kept very carefully controlled. She walked to the defendant's table with her spine straight and her eyes forward, and when she saw Edwin standing in the gallery, she met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds and then looked away. And those 2 seconds contained something that he intended, when this was over, to spend considerable time addressing properly. August Hartley sat beside her as her legal counsel, which he had agreed to do for a fee that Edwin suspected was significantly reduced from his usual rate, because Hartley was one of those lawyers who still remembered why he had become one. Prescott presented the prosecution's case first, and it was thin in the way of cases that have been constructed backwards from a desired conclusion. He named his witness, a man named Roy Cutter, who had worked as a laborer for Voss Operations, and who testified that he had seen Josephine Crawford near the alley behind the saloon on the evening in question. He described the note as evidence of premeditation. He presented the medical report on Gerald Voss's injury. It all sounded, in the aggregate, more substantial than it was, because Prescott delivered it in the flat, certain voice of official authority, which carries weight that the underlying evidence sometimes does not deserve. Then August Hartley stood up, and he began to take it apart. Professor Cord's handwriting analysis came in first. Cord testified for 20 minutes with the careful, specific language of someone who has thought very hard about how to explain a technical matter to a non-technical audience, and by the time he finished, there was not a person in that courthouse who could say with confidence that the note was genuine. Judge Beaumont asked 3 intelligent questions and wrote down the answers. Pete Hollings testified next, and his account of Gerald Voss's stated intentions was delivered in the blunt, uncomfortable way of a man who is not accustomed to public speaking, but is determined to say what he came to say. When Prescott attempted to challenge his credibility, Pete described in detail why he had left Voss' employment and what he had been asked to do, and the specific detail of it was the kind of thing you do not invent because you cannot, and the courtroom was very quiet when he finished. Then Edwin Crawford stood up in the gallery and asked to address the court. Prescott objected. Beaumont overruled the objection with a look that said he had heard enough from the prosecution for the time being and was not inclined to limit the defense's avenues of inquiry. "She did nothing wrong," Edwin said, and then he said everything he knew, everything he had ridden 60 miles in 2 days to prove. He laid it out clearly and in order: the history of Gerald Voss's pursuit of Josephine from Kansas City, the formal complaint that had been filed, and that the court itself had record of, the expert testimony about the handwriting, the witness who had heard Gerald state his intentions explicitly, and the specific impossibility of the scenario Prescott was proposing, given the timeline and Josephine's documented location at the ranch in the days preceding the incident. He spoke for nearly 30 minutes, and when he stopped, the silence in the room was the particular silence of people who have had a story they thought they understood rearranged beneath them. Judge Beaumont removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I would like," he said, in the measured tone of a man making a decision, "to speak with the alleged victim directly. Gerald Voss was brought into the courthouse from the hotel room where he was recovering. He looked worse than Edwin had expected, genuinely hurt rather than performing injury, and Edwin felt the first flicker of something that complicated his reading of events, because if Gerald was genuinely hurt, then someone had genuinely hurt him, and whoever that was, it was not Josephine." Gerald sat in the witness chair and looked at the judge and then at his brother Silas in the gallery and then at Josephine, and the sequence of those glances told Edwin something. The judge asked him directly what he remembered about the evening in question. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Silas again. Silas Voss, for the first time in Edwin's experience of him, looked slightly uncomfortable. "Mr. Voss," Judge Beaumont said, with the particular patience of someone who has all day, "I am asking you what happened in that alley." Gerald said, finally, in a voice that was rough with something that might have been shame or might have been residual injury, "I was drunk. I got into an argument with someone. I do not remember clearly who. It was not Mrs. Crawford. She was not there." The courtroom erupted again, louder than before. What had happened, as Edwin pieced it together in the days after the trial, was this: Gerald had indeed been in that alley, drunk and belligerent, and had been struck by a man whose identity Gerald would never publicly state, but who Edwin was reasonably certain was a business associate of Gerald's own who had lost patience with him. The note had been placed in Gerald's pocket by someone working for Sila's, intended to be found and to implicate Josephine, and Gerald had not known about the note until it was discovered, and the story started building around it. And Gerald, for all his faults, and they were considerable, had not been willing to stand up in court in front of a judge who was clearly unimpressed with the prosecution, and tell a lie that his brother's money had purchased, when the lie was going to put an innocent woman in prison. There was a certain poetic quality to the fact that Silas Voss's plan had ultimately failed because Gerald Voss, the very person the plan was designed to use, had found a line he would not cross. Judge Beaumont dismissed all charges against Josephine Crawford. He did it with a speech that made clear his feelings about how the case had been brought, which was as close as a judge could come in 1878 to accusing a sheriff of incompetence or complicity without actually using those words. He then ordered the shackles removed from her wrists, which was the moment that Edwin, still standing at the gallery rail, felt the last of the controlled anger drain out of him and leave behind something that was much simpler and much larger. Josephine stood and rubbed her wrists and looked at the judge and thanked him quietly. Then she looked across the room at Edwin, and this time she did not look away after 2 seconds. He crossed the room in about 4 strides, which was faster than he strictly needed to move but slower than he wanted to, and when he reached her he stopped and looked at her and said, "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "I am very all right." "Good," he said, and then, because the courthouse was still full of people, and because Edwin Crawford was a man who was better with direct statements than elaborate gestures, he simply said, "I need you to know that I would have burned down every legal structure in this territory if that was what it took." She looked at him with those amber-brown eyes and said, "I know. That is one of the things I love about you." It was the first time either of them had used that word directly, without the cautious indirection that practical people apply to the things they feel most intensely, and the effect of it on Edwin was immediate and visible, because Pablo Reyes, who had come to town that morning and was watching from near the door, later reported that Edwin Crawford's expression in that moment was one he had never expected to see on the man's face and hoped very much to see again. They walked out of the Redemption Creek courthouse together into the September afternoon, and behind them they could hear the noise of the town processing what had just happened, and ahead of them was the wagon and the road back to the Red Mesa, and 4,000 acres of Colorado high country that were theirs together. The aftermath of the trial moved through Redemption Creek in the complex way that aftermath always moves through small towns, in conversations and shifted alliances, and the slow, uncomfortable reordering of who was trusted and who was not. Sheriff Prescott found his position significantly more precarious in the months following, as 3 members of the town council asked pointed questions about how the case had been brought and on what basis, and while Prescott was not immediately removed from his position, he was a man diminished, and he seemed to know it. Silas Voss withdrew from active engagement with Redemption Creek social life for a period of some months. He continued to operate his cattle company with his customary efficiency, but the 4th approach to acquiring the Red Mesa was not made, and Edwin did not expect a 5th. The exposure in the courtroom of how the plan had been constructed was not enough to charge Silas with anything, because Gerald would not elaborate publicly, and the connections between Silas and the various elements of the case were demonstrable only in the aggregate, not in any single provable action. But the story was out in the county, and the county knew what it knew, and Silas Voss was a man who cared about his standing more than almost anything. Gerald Voss left Redemption Creek within a fortnight of the trial and did not return. Where he went, Edwin did not inquire and did not much care, provided it was far. Roy Cutter, the false witness, gave a sworn statement to August Hartley 2 weeks after the trial that described in detail how he had been recruited and what he had been paid to say, and Hartley filed it with the court as part of an ongoing inquiry into the conduct of the case. It was not, ultimately enough to bring criminal charges, but it was enough to make the record permanent and available, and permanent available records have a way of surfacing at inconvenient moments for the people whose names appear in them. October came to the red mesa in the color of burning. The aspen groves on the upper pastures turned gold and then amber, and the air at dawn had the clean, cold bite of approaching winter, and the cattle were fat from the summer grasses and ready to be driven down to the lower valley. Edwin led the drive himself, as he always did, and Josephine rode alongside him on the gray mare she had adopted from a neighbor's horse sale in August, and the drive took 3 days through country that was so beautiful it was almost aggressive about it. And at the end of the 3 days, they came home to the red mesa in the golden afternoon in Pablo, and the hands made a meal that was festive in the informal, unannounced way that ranch celebrations usually are. In the evenings, as the temperature dropped and the days shortened, Edwin and Josephine developed the domestic routines that become, over time, the architecture of a shared life. He read in the evenings when the work allowed it, and she read too, and sometimes they read aloud to each other, which was something neither of them had done since childhood and which turned out to be enormously pleasurable in the specific way of recovering something you had forgotten you missed. They talked about the ranch and its future, conversations that were genuinely collaborative because Josephine had opinions about the long-term management of the operation that were grounded in her understanding of the finances, and those opinions were good. They talked, gradually, about the things they had not talked about before, the years before Redemption Creek, the losses and the specific shapes of their respective solitudes. Edwin told her about his father and mother in a way he had not spoken of them to anyone since they died, and she listened with the full attention that was her particular gift. And then she told him about Kansas City and the years before that, and the telling of it was painful in places, and then, oddly, less painful for having been told. One evening in November, he found her at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand and a complicated expression on her face. And when he sat across from her, she showed him the letter, which was from her younger sister in Missouri, whom she had not been in contact with for nearly 2 years due to the disruption of her departure from Kansas City and the absence of a stable address to which correspondence could be sent. The letter had found her through Mrs. Decker, who had an improbable network of postal contacts across 3 states. The sister's name was Clara, and she was 22, and the letter was 3 pages of relief and news and a request. Clara was not well situated. Her husband had died the previous spring, and she had a son who was 18 months old, and she was asking whether Josephine knew of any opportunity in her part of the territory. Edwin read the letter and looked at Josephine and said, "Write back and tell her to come." Josephine looked at him. "Edwin, this is your home." "It is our home," he said. "And it has room. Write the letter." Clara arrived in March of the following year on the stage from Denver, thinner than the photograph she had sent, and with a toddler on her hip who was called James, and who, over the following weeks, became the unofficial mascot of the Red Mesa Ranch hands, who competed quietly for the privilege of making him laugh. Clara was quieter than her sister and had a gentler manner but the same quality of directness when she spoke, and she proved useful in the house and in the kitchen, and, to Edwin's mild surprise, with the horses, which she understood and worked with a patience and confidence that was impressive. She and Josephine together had the particular warmth of sisters who have been apart long enough to miss each other, and are now, in the recovery of that company, more appreciative of it than they might otherwise have been. The ranch continued to grow, carefully, in the manner of an operation managed by people who understood both the present conditions and the long-term potential. In the spring of 1879, Edwin made a deal with the railroad that Pablo had been advocating for 2 years, securing freight rates that made the fall cattle drive significantly more profitable, and Josephine's accounting of the new arrangement produced a quarterly report that the bank in town described as, again, remarkably coherent, and also as indicating strong expansion capacity. In June of 1879, Josephine told Edwin she was expecting their first child, and the way she told him, sitting at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning with the directness that was her fundamental mode of communication, produced in Edwin Crawford an expression that Pablo Reyes, if he had been there to see it, would have added to the small collection of expressions he had never expected to witness on that particular face. Edwin sat very still for a moment and then said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also apparently expecting our first child. Those two things can coexist." "Yes," he said, "of course they can." He reached across the breakfast table and took her hand, which had flour on it from the morning baking, and held it in both of his. "I am going to be very bad at not worrying about you." "I know," she said. "I find it endearing." "Do not tell Pablo," he said. "He will be insufferable about being right." She smiled at him, the full smile she kept for moments when the professional composure was entirely unnecessary, and it was still, after more than a year, the thing that did the most to him. "Edwin," she said gently, "Pablo is going to know the moment he looks at you." Pablo did know the moment he looked at Edwin, which was approximately 40 minutes later, and he was insufferable about it in the most affectionate way possible for the rest of the day. The pregnancy proceeded without significant complication, which Edwin managed to accept as reassuring only with the daily application of considerable effort, because the specific nature of loving someone deeply is that their well-being becomes the most important variable in your world, and the absence of control over it is exquisitely uncomfortable. Josephine tolerated his concern with the pragmatic grace of someone who knew it came from a place she respected, and she also, with equal grace, refused to be managed or coddled, which he ultimately came to be grateful for because it forced him to trust her judgment about her own body, which was a useful thing for a man to learn. Their son was born in February of 1880, which was a cold, still month at the Red Mesa with snow on the high country, and the creek frozen over, and the ranch quiet in the particular holding breath way of deep winter. The birth was attended by the doctor who came out from town and by Clara, who proved in the event to be calm and practical, and exactly the right person to have in the room. Edwin was not in the room, because the doctor was firm about that in the convention of the era, but he was in the hallway outside the door for 6 hours, and Pablo was in the kitchen below making coffee. He did not drink and praying quietly in Spanish. The boy was healthy and large, and had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, which made him look immediately like someone with opinions, which turned out to be accurate. They named him Thomas, after Edwin's father, and the household of the Red Mesa reorganized itself around his presence with the cheerful chaos that babies introduce into even the most orderly environments. Edwin Crawford, who had spent 5 years in a house that was too quiet and too empty, stood in the kitchen of the ranch house on the first morning after his son's birth, listening to the sound of Josephine and Clara talking in the upstairs bedroom, and the sound of little James toddling across the floor above, and the particular small sounds of a newborn that carry further than they should, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled so long he had stopped remembering what settled felt like. He went out to the barn and told Pablo, and Pablo embraced him in the robust way of men who do not otherwise embrace, and then wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and pretended he had not. Summer came again, the third summer on the Red Mesa as it now existed, with Josephine's accounts showing the strongest numbers in the ranch's recorded history, and the herd at its highest count, and the new freight arrangement producing exactly the returns she had projected. Thomas Crawford grew at the rate that healthy babies grow, which is to say alarmingly fast, and demonstrated early an interest in the world outside the house that required constant vigilance from everyone around him. In August of 1880, August Hartley came out to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with a document that he had been preparing. He said, at the request of several parties in the county, and that represented, in his considered legal opinion, the permanent closure of any remaining legal question arising from the events of September 1878. It was a formal exoneration, signed by the new county sheriff, who had replaced Prescott after Prescott resigned in the spring, and by the county judge, and it stated plainly and on the record that the charges brought against Josephine Crawford in that year had been without merit, that the evidence supporting them had been fabricated, and that the court's record had been amended accordingly to reflect the dismissal as a full exoneration on its merits rather than a procedural dismissal. Hartley presented it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time to deliver something this definitive. Josephine read it and thanked him and set it on the kitchen table, and later that evening Edwin found her standing in the study, which was her workspace now as much as it had ever been his father's, holding the document and reading it again. He came to stand beside her close and looked at it over her shoulder. "It is strange," she said. "I knew I had done nothing wrong from the moment they arrested me. I have known it every day since. I did not expect that reading this would feel like anything different." "Does it?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes, somewhat. It is the official record that agrees with me. I thought I would not care about that. It turns out I care a little." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him slightly, and they looked at the document together in the evening light of the study. "It is over," he said. "It has been over for a while," she said. "But yes, now it is over in every way." He turned her gently to face him and looked at her for a moment in the way he still had to remind himself he was allowed to do, the looking that contained everything he felt about her and that she met with the same openness. "I love you," he said. "I should say it more often and more clearly." "You say it clearly enough," she said, "in most of the ways that matter." "I want to say it in this way too," he said, "clearly with the words. I love you, Josephine." She touched his face with one hand and smiled. "I know. I love you too, Edwin," clearly with the words. Thomas began making his opinions about being left out known from the next room, which he did by banging something wooden against the floor, and they looked at each other, and the solemnity of the moment dissolved into something lighter and better. In the spring of 1881, Silas Voss sold his cattle company and left the territory. The circumstances of this departure were a matter of some speculation in Redemption Creek, but the version that August Hartley considered most credible was that the exposure of his methods in the 1878 trial, combined with a federal land inquiry that had begun looking at how certain properties in the county had changed hands in the decade prior, had made his continued operation more complicated than profitable. Whatever the reason, his departure was not mourned widely, and the land he left was eventually parceled and settled by 3 families who were, in the general estimation of the county, considerably better neighbors. Clara Slater married a farmer named Tom Aldridge in the summer of 1881, a widower of 35 with a farm 12 miles from the Red Mesa, and an uncomplicated warmth that suited her well. The wedding was small and happy, and held on the Red Mesa in the garden that Josephine had planted the previous spring, and little James, now nearly 4, served as an accidental centerpiece by escaping from Clara's grasp during the ceremony and being retrieved from the vicinity of the vegetable garden by Pablo Reyes, who returned him to the proceedings with an expression of heroic dignity. Thomas Crawford, at 18 months, was present for the wedding primarily as a presence in his father's arms, where he watched the proceedings with the serious attention of someone who is storing everything away for later. Pablo Reyes, in the autumn of 1881, informed Edwin that he planned to marry a widow in town named Maria Santos, who ran the laundry and had been, for the past 3 years, the subject of a courtship so prolonged and careful that the entire town had developed opinions about it. Edwin gave him 2 weeks off for the wedding, and a raise that Pablo protested and accepted in the same breath. The Red Mesa continued to grow and to change and to remain, in its fundamental character, what it had always been, a working ranch in the high country of Colorado Territory, run by people who understood what they had and took care of it. In the winter of 1882, Josephine told Edwin she was expecting again, this time at supper rather than at breakfast. And Thomas, who was now nearly 2 and had developed the verbal capacity to make his presence in any conversation felt, added his own commentary to the announcement by banging his spoon on his bowl and saying his current favorite word, which was more, and the room filled with laughter. Their daughter was born in July of 1882 in the heat of summer, and they named her Eleanor after Josephine's mother, and she arrived into the world with a considerable opinion of it already formed, which was clear from her first moments and did not diminish as the months passed. Thomas received her with the dignified uncertainty of a firstborn confronted with a permanent new development, and then, with the adaptability of the very young, incorporated her into his understanding of how things were. The years turned. The ranch grew and prospered. Thomas grew and began to ride, young as his father had ridden, with the same ease and attentiveness. Eleanor grew and became a person of considerable character, inheriting from her mother the quality of listening, and from her father the quality of directness, in combination that sometimes made Pablo Reyes shake his head with the fond expression of someone watching history rhyme. Josephine's accounts for the Red Mesa in 1883 were reviewed by the county assessor as part of a routine evaluation, and the assessor noted in his report that the Crawford Ranch was the most efficiently managed operation of its size in the county and one of the best in the territory. She read this note aloud to Edwin over the breakfast table one morning, and he said, "I know," and then, though I should say it out loud more often, she looked at him over the report with the smile that was still, after 5 years, the thing he most looked forward to every morning. Edwin Crawford, at 33, was a man who had come to understand in a deep and practical way something that the younger version of himself had known only abstractly, which was that the quality of a life is determined less by what you build and more by who you build it with. The Red Mesa was 4,000 good acres of Colorado high country, and it was his and it was Josephine's, and the work of it was their common work, and the future of it was their common future, and the days in it were full in the way that days only become when they are shared with someone whose presence is genuinely irreplaceable. He had stood in a courtroom and said she had done nothing wrong. He had ridden 60 miles to prove it. He had laid everything he knew and everything he felt in front of a judge and a town and the specific hostile gaze of Silas Voss, and it had been the most important thing he had ever done, not because it had been brave, though he supposed it was, but because it had been necessary, and necessary things have a way of clarifying who you are. What he had not expected, or perhaps what he had not let himself expect, was that proving her innocence would be only the beginning. That the real work would be everything after. The mornings and evenings and seasons, the conversations that went long and the silences that were comfortable, the son with her eyes and the daughter with his stubbornness, and the ranch growing under their combined care, and Pablo's good hands and the land itself, which asked nothing of them except to be respected. On a September evening in 1883, exactly 5 years from the morning the deputies had arrived with their oversized shackles, Edwin and Josephine sat on the porch steps of the ranch house in the late gold of the afternoon, which was doing operatic things to the western sky as it always did in September, and Thomas was in the barn with Pablo learning to mend harness, and Eleanor was asleep inside in the peaceable way of small children who have worn themselves out entirely. And the Red Mesa was quiet around them in the particular way that a place is quiet when everything in it is, for the moment, right. "I have been thinking," Edwin said. "About what?" Josephine asked. "About the fact that 5 years ago today was approximately the worst week of my life," he said, "and also the week when I understood, completely and with no remaining ambiguity, exactly how I felt about you." She turned to look at him. "Fear has a way of clarifying things." "It was not fear," he said, "or it was not only fear. It was the absolute certainty that there was nothing on this earth more important than making sure you were free and safe, and exactly where you were supposed to be. She was quiet for a moment, watching the sky do its extravagant work in the west. "Where I was supposed to be," she said thoughtfully. "I have thought about that. I used to think I was a person who ended up in places by accident, running from something and happening to stop somewhere. I do not think that anymore." "Where do you think you ended up?" he asked. She leaned against his shoulder. "Exactly where I was supposed to be," she said, "from the very first day." He put his arm around her, and she settled against him, and they watched the light go down over the canyon walls and the upper pastures, and the creek that ran clear and cold through the south quarter of the land they had made together into something that would outlast both of them. The horses moved in the lower field. The smell of supper drifted from the kitchen where Clara was, having come for the week with Tom Aldridge and James and their new infant daughter, who was 2 months old and had not yet formed strong views about anything, which made her the most restful person currently on the property. From the barn came the sound of Pablo's voice and Thomas's laughter, and then the sound of the barn door and 2 sets of footsteps, and Thomas came running toward the porch with the concentrated energy of a small boy who has had a good afternoon and wants to report on it in full detail. And Edwin straightened and opened his arm in welcome, and Thomas arrived like something fired from a gun and climbed into the space between his parents with the complete confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt that there was room. "Pablo says I can mend a full harness by the summer," Thomas announced. "Pablo is optimistic," Edwin said. "Pablo is right," Josephine said, because she had watched Thomas practice and she knew what Pablo knew, which was that the boy had his father's hands and his mother's patience and was going to be genuinely good at the things he decided to be good at. Thomas looked between them with the bright, assessing eyes that were unambiguously his mother's. "Were you talking about important things?" he asked. "Very important things," Edwin said gravely. Thomas considered this. "What things?" Edwin looked at Josephine over their son's head, and she looked back at him, and they were both smiling. "About being exactly where we are supposed to be," Edwin said. Thomas thought about this for approximately 2 seconds, which was his attention allocation for philosophical matters, and then said, "Pablo says supper is in the barn tonight because Aunt Clara has too many people in the kitchen." "Pablo says many things," Josephine said. "He is usually right," Edwin said, and stood, lifting Thomas with him in the easy movement of a man accustomed to physical weight. And Thomas grabbed his collar and laughed, and Josephine rose beside them, and the 3 of them went into the warm interior of the ranch house together. And the Colorado evening settled over the red mesa in all its colors, and the land was quiet and whole and theirs. The red mesa would stand for another 40 years under the Crawford name, and in that time it would change in the ways that things must change, growing with the territory as Colorado became a state in 1876 and grew with the rail lines and the settlement that pushed west through every decade. Thomas Crawford would eventually run it, and he would run it with the same practical care and collaborative spirit that he had learned watching his parents. And Alina Crawford would become a teacher in Redemption Creek who was known for the same quality of listening that her mother had possessed, and who would have occasion, more than once, to explain to her students what her parents had built and how they had built it, and what it had cost, and what it was worth. But those were later stories. This one ends on a September evening in 1883, with the sun going down in gold and red over the canyon walls of the Colorado high country, and Edwin Crawford and Josephine Slater Crawford standing in their kitchen, surrounded by the sounds and warmth of a full house, and the particular, unhurried peace that comes to people who have fought for something real and built something true, and are standing in the middle of it, knowing exactly what they have. The shackles were gone. The courtroom was years behind them. The forged note was on the permanent record as the forgery it was. Gerald Voss was gone to somewhere. He was not anyone's particular problem. Silas Voss was gone to wherever men go when the architecture of their ambition collapses. The Red Mesa was theirs. 4,000 acres and 2 children, and a foreman who was insufferable in the most affectionate way imaginable, and a reputation in the county for square dealing and strong cattle and excellent bookkeeping. And Edwin Crawford, who had ridden 15 miles at a dead gallop to stand up in a sweltering courthouse and say that a woman had done nothing wrong, who had then ridden 60 miles in 2 days to prove it, who had faced down a judge and a sheriff and the most powerful man in the county and the man he loved looking at him from across a room in oversized shackles, had gotten everything right that he had, over the previous year, terrified himself by wanting. He had done nothing less than what the situation demanded. He had done exactly what loyalty and love required. And standing in the kitchen of the Red Mesa on a September evening with his wife beside him and his son in his arms and the smell of supper in the air and his daughter's small sounds drifting from upstairs, he would not have changed a single day of it. Not one.